I hope you're all well, and whomever I can see on the screen, you look well and safe at home. Well, since the coronavirus has considerably slowed down or delayed any activity in the area of foreign relations, like in most areas, by the way, I'd like us to consider today a principle that has been the subject of long and heated debates not only within the US political circles, but also in the public opinion at large. That principle is the principle of intervention, military intervention, or non-intervention, and its pros and cons. Now, in recent years, as the casualties and financial costs of the United States wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Libya have mounted, America's appetite for new interventions and its commitment to the existing ones have understandably diminished. As a result, the conventional wisdom now holds that the emphasis of the American foreign policy should be placed on military restraint, allowing Washington to focus on other pressing issues. This position seems to be one of the very few principles shared by all of the presidential candidates in the 2020 Democratic primary and President Donald Trump. It's not hard to see why. The cost of these wars has been extraordinarily high. For instance, with more than 4,500 US military personnel killed in Iraq and an additional 2,500 killed in Afghanistan, plus tens of thousands injured in both wars, to say nothing of the heavy casualties among allied forces, military contractors, and civilians. Critics of these resource-intensive operations blame them for bogging down the United States in a region of relative strategic importance and distracting Washington from the greatest threats of China and Russia. With the cost so high and the benefits seen as low, the imperative is obvious to political leaders in both parties. Get out of the existing conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and avoid starting new ones. In his State of the Union earlier this year, Trump declared that, I quote, "Great nations do not fight endless wars." And Joe Biden, the former vice president and current presidential candidate, Democratic presidential candidate, has promised to end the forever wars. He also described the Obama administration's withdrawal of US forces from Iraq in 2011 as one of the proudest moments of his life, and he has called for pulling US forces out of Afghanistan. As I said earlier, many American foreign policy experts are of a similar mind. And the idea of a offshore balancing, what is an offshore balancing? It's a strategy in which the United States would drastically scale back its global military presence and reduce the frequency of its intervention is gaining traction. However, the quasi-apparent consensus on this issue around ending endless wars is more problematic. Consider, for example, the many qualifications that Democratic presidential candidates have applied to withdrawal from Afghanistan. Biden did say that he would bring US combat troops home during his first term. But he also indicated that he remains open to what he called a residual presence to conduct counter-terrorist operations. Roughly the same approach as President Trump's and most other Democratic candidates. In addition, the reality of being commander-in-chief further complicates this matter. On the campaign trail, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Trump each pledged to engage in fewer foreign military adventures and redirect resources towards needs at home. Once in office, however, each of them reluctantly proceeded to not only continue existing wars, but also launch new offensives. The result is that the US has employed military force over 200 times since the end of the Cold War. Many of these operations have taken place in or around the Middle East, including in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Others, less frequently recalled, occurred elsewhere, as in Bosnia, in Colombia, in Haiti, in Kosovo, in Liberia, and the Philippines. That being said, just because the US has intervened so frequently over its history does not mean that it will continue to do so or that it should do so. The case against military intervention generally takes 5 forms. And although there are elements of truth to each, as we're going to see, they also obscure other more complicated realities. Now let's see these arguments for restraining, for non-intervention. The first argument holds that the United States does not need to employ military means in response to terrorism, civil wars, mass atrocities, and other problems that are not its business. Washington, this thinking goes, has used force against terrorists in countries ranging from Nigeria to Pakistan, with massive human and financial costs. As the threats have diminished in those regions, so should American attention. As the threats, so civil wars in Libya, in Syria, and Yemen may be tragic, but they do not demand a US military response, any more than did the atrocities in Rwanda, Eastern Congo, or Darfur in Sudan. Such a narrow view of American interests, however, carries its own risks. Terrorism remains a threat, and the effect of successful attacks on Americans goes beyond their immediate casualties to include increased pressure to restrict civil liberties at home and wage impromptu operations abroad. Operations that end up costing more and being less efficient than long-term, better planned ones would be. For instance, after the Islamic State or ISIS took hold in Iraq and Syria, and footage of terrorists decapitating American hostages horrified the public opinion, Obama undertook a far larger operation that would have likely been necessary had he left a residual force in Iraq after 2011. As for genocide and civil war, certain cases can pose a real threat to US interests or be so offensive to American values as to merit intervention. Successive presidents have used military might to prevent, to halt, or punish mass atrocities. Clinton, for instance, to seize the genocide against Bosnian Muslims in the Balkans, Obama to protect the Yazidi minority in Iraq, and Trump after Bashar al-Assad's chemical attacks against his own people in Syria. There is every reason to believe that similar cases would arise in the future. The second argument against military intervention highlights the supposedly poor track record of these interventions. For all of the United States' good intentions, stopping terrorism, ending genocide, stabilizing countries, or spreading democracy, Washington simply is not very successful in its attempts. Iraq and Libya look worse today than where the wars against Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi began. And the Taliban currently control more of Afghanistan than at any time since the US military intervention in that country back in 2001. Long gone are also the US aspirations to turn those countries into democracies that then would promote liberalism beyond their borders. Yet this argument ignores the many other times in which the use of American military force worked. It ejected, for instance, Saddam from Kuwait. It ended the war in Bosnia. It stopped ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. It paved the way for a democratic transition in Liberia. And it helped defeat narco-terrorism and bring temporary peace in Colombia. Even in Afghanistan, it should not be forgotten that Washington denied Al-Qaeda a safe haven. And in Iraq and Syria, it eliminated ISIS's physical presence. In order to get an accurate picture of intervention's mixed track record, one cannot cherry pick the disastrous cases or the successful ones. The third argument against military intervention points to the slippery slope involved in such efforts. In other words, start a military campaign and the US will never get out. After the 1995 Dayton Peace Accord ended the ethnic conflict in Bosnia, US troops stayed in the area for 10 years, and NATO retains a presence in Kosovo to this day. Also, the US seems to be stuck in Afghanistan, as we saw that already, because without a peace deal with the Taliban, the American-backed government in Kabul would fail. In Iraq, Obama removed all US troops only to send them back in when ISIS established a vast presence there. Start a military intervention again, and it often seems like you can never leave. This argument, however, seems to overlook the stark difference between what it means to have US forces in Iraq, what it meant rather to have US forces in Iraq during the peak of the war, and what it means to have US troops there now to train Iraqi forces. Just as there is a massive gulf between deploying troops to Afghanistan during the troop surge there and keeping a residual presence to strengthen the government of the country and its security forces. The reality is that some American interests are worth the price of continued military deployments. And the aim should be to diminish those costs in blood and treasure as the conditions stabilize. Even once they do, there may remain a presence, a US presence in there, an enduring role, particularly when the US troops presence is the only thing maintaining the domestic political equilibrium, as was the case in Iraq before 2011, and as it is true in Afghanistan today. The first argument can be summarized in one question: why us? Why must the United States always run to the rescue, especially when other countries are perfectly capable of taking on such burdens and may have even more reasons to intervene? Europe, for instance, is geographically closer to Syria and Libya. Europe is at far greater risk from terrorism and refugee flows and possesses capable military forces of its own. Also, Middle East allies like Saudi Arabia or the Arab Emirates have their own resources. So the American role might not be so indispensable after all. But the reality is quite different, as despite all the contributions of United States partners and allies, more often than not, only the United States has the will and the capability to lead successful military operations. France did lead a successful operation in Côte d'Ivoire in 2004, and more recently in Mali in 2013. And the UK led an operation also in Sierra Leone in 2000, but those were exceptions. Iraq would not have left Kuwait in 1991 had the US not led the effort. Mass slaughter in the Balkans during the 1990s would not have ended without a dominant US role, even though it took place on European soil. In Afghanistan and Syria, US allies have made it clear that they will stay there only as long as the US does. In other instances, America's European allies have proved uninterested in taking matters in their own hands when Washington has declined to intervene itself. In Libya, after Gaddafi's fall, the Europeans failed to impose security, even as a growing number of refugees and migrants set sail across the Mediterranean. In Syria, before US bombing began, the European allies undertook no military campaign against ISIS, even as the arrival of Syrian refugees destabilized European politics. And in a few instances when US allies did take matters in their own hands, they made a bad situation worse. For instance, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates decided to intervene in Yemen's civil war, but their brutal and indiscriminate campaign led to a humanitarian crisis and strengthened the very Iranian role that it sought to eliminate. The fifth and final argument most frequently offered for getting out of a military intervention relates to its costs, both direct ones, such as lives lost and damages inflicted, and the dollars spent, and opportunity costs. According to this line of reasoning, since it is increasingly clear that China and Russia represent the foremost challenge to the United States over the long term, and that the competition with them has begun in earnest, there is no justification for tying up valuable resources in less important military interventions. Here too, there is no clear-cut answer, as the emphasis on great power competition should not obscure the need for an active approach to counter terrorism. After all, the George W. Bush administration entered office hoping to focus on China, only to see its best laid plans upended by the 9/11 attacks. Withdrawing prematurely from terrorist safe havens, such as Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, would threaten the great power emphasis necessary in the next phase of the United States global actions. A major terrorist attack on US soil, for instance, would likely cause Washington to once again embrace counterterrorism as its primary security priority, leaving it more vulnerable to threats from China and Russia. Now, US military intervention take diverse forms, obviously. An isolated drone strike in a remote area in Pakistan, you understand very well, is quite different from a theoretical future war with China. As a result, there are no precise rules when leaders should or should not use force. Context matters, and human judgment always comes into play. Yet it is possible to sketch out a few guidelines on based on the experience of recent decades that should guide the general conduct of US decision-making when it comes to military intervention. The first guideline would be to avoid resting upon the supposed lessons of previous interventions. It is often said that the generals are always fighting the last war, and the same can be said about policymakers. Sometimes they draw the right lessons, but sometimes they do not. Cases in point. Hoping to avoid a Vietnam-style quagmire, the George H.W. Bush administration fought the first Gulf War, trying to limit its objective to the specific aim of restoring Kuwaiti sovereignty. But because Saddam Hussein was left in power, the Iraq problem festered. The second Iraq war was supposed to finish the job, but it showed how a supposedly short conflict could lead to an indefinite occupation. To prevent such a situation from happening in Libya, Obama decided to help oust Gaddafi, but used air power only as a means to keep American boots off the ground. As a result, political chaos leading to a de facto breakup of Libya followed. In Syria, where Obama and Trump would fight terrorists without attempting to remove President Assad, led to a foreign military intervention that gradually bolstered Assad's influence. Thus, sticking to rigid lines based on prior errors can easily lead to new and different ones. Also, analogies to past wars and unrelated historical experiences or aspirations to abstract principles, such as needing to be on the right side of history, add little value to determine whether to act or not. Another guideline would be to pick interventions with clear objectives and then commit to those objectives. A clear definition of the aims pursued by military intervention will force policymakers to distinguish between, for instance, managing a problem, for instance, in Afghanistan, such as preventing Afghanistan from becoming a terrorist safe haven, and solving it, such as rendering that country a Taliban-free modern democracy. The decision makers also should have a reasonable expectation that allies, especially those in the region in question, would join the effort, whether those allies are in the likes of Afghan President Ghani, or exiles in Iraq, or European troops in Libya, or the Syrian Democratic Forces. A more nuanced approach to determining whether an intervention is politically sustainable is also needed. The traditional model has been for the president to paint a picture of the threat and then elicit the support of the public opinion for war, hoping to wind down operations before the public grows impatient and weary of the conflict. Yet maintaining popular support over the long run hinges less on a war's duration and more on its human casualties, financial costs, and perceived progress. So instead of suggesting that ultimate success is just around the corner, policymakers should articulate the case for an enduring engagement and then work to lower the human and financial costs associated with the intervention. Perhaps the most difficult guideline is to rigorously estimate the long-term costs and benefits. Although such an assessment seems obvious, recent experience suggests it is not done very often. In the run-up to the Iraq War, for example, US leaders minimized the estimated costs of troops and reconstruction aid and wildly overinflated their projections of success. Also, during the deliberation over intervention in Libya, the US policymakers ignored the lesson that would-be nuclear proliferators such as North Korea's chairman Kim might draw in watching the United States overthrow a leader, Gaddafi, who had previously turned over his weapons of mass destructions. And as a matter of fact, the North Korean leader has been using that argument ever since, which is that, as we saw it in our previous classes, that North Korea needs a nuclear bomb because the example of Gaddafi, who gave up his nuclear program, military program, did not prevent him being overthrown by the United States. So the only asset that Kim claims to have, it's a nuclear weapon, which he believes would prevent the United States from overthrowing him. While all these guidelines cannot possibly supply all the answers, had they been applied to past and potential interventions, they would have helped to rule in or rule out some of them. In the case of past interventions, the Balkans and Rwanda would likely have passed the test, particularly given the limited objectives. In the Balkans, it was basically to end the atrocities without overthrowing governments. And in Rwanda, it was only to reinforce the US peacekeeping presence already on the ground. The 2001 decision to attack Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan would also have met the mark, as would have the anti-ISIS campaign in Iraq and Syria, given that non-military approaches had been unable to find a solution. As for the ongoing interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, the guideline would rule in favor of a residual, indefinite presence of troops, which would help prevent those countries from regressing into terrorist hubs. And in the cases of Afghanistan and Iraq, would support the governments that keeps them from doing so. In addition, the costs of a possible redeployment to those countries after a descent into terror-ridden chaos, as happened in Iraq in 2011, would almost certainly be higher than the costs of remaining. Simply ignoring the emergence of terrorist sanctuaries is not an option. Ultimately, the unpredictability of world events puts a priority on human judgment and undermines rigid formulas. That is precisely why it is so unwise of current presidential candidates to make categorical commitments to end the US involvement in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and why it is unwise for Trump to focus on an exit to those conflicts rather than the right conditions that would safely enable one. If there is a lesson to be learned from the justified frustration with the US post-Cold War war approach, and pledges to dial back military intervention and end forever wars, is that far more subtlety is needed when it comes to considering if, when, and how the US should use force abroad. No grand strategy can be built on the presumption that military intervention is mostly an erroneous activity of yesteryears, rather than an enduring feature of US foreign policy. At the end of the day, the United States remains a global power with strongly held interests and values that require defending. While it does not need to look abroad for enemies to destroy, it cannot delude itself, believing that such enemies have disappeared. And that is probably the main reason why the non-intervention theory as a blanket should be ruled out as a future policy, foreign policy, applicable in all cases. More nuance and more subtlety is needed to study particular cases when to intervene or to keep a permanent presence, military presence somewhere, and when to withdraw. All right, so I'm listening to your, I'm waiting to read your question if you have any. But this principle, I wanted to bring it up because, first of all, we don't have much news in terms of foreign policy. Nothing is really happening right now. Everything is stopped, number one. And also because the question, the issue of non-intervention or versus intervention has been really one of the main subject of debates between different in Washington, in the foreign policy circles in Washington. And it will also come up quite often, as you're going to see during the presidential campaign, whenever the presidential campaign starts and when it starts, in terms of foreign policy. So, I don't know. I see no questions on my screen. I don't understand.
Pierre, look at your,
Yeah.
look at, if you hit manage participants, you should see the chat button underneath that, the Zoom group chat. Okay, there's a bunch of questions.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks,
Okay.
Michelle. I told you, I
That's
don't
okay.
know what.
Sometimes things strangely disappear, and it takes somebody to show you where they disappeared to.
Absolutely, thank you. All right, from Douglas. Pierre, wouldn't the reluctance of European countries to intervene in the Middle East be the close proximity to many of the target areas and countries versus US and higher probability of reactive terror attacks? Thanks, Doc. Well, I don't know if that can be used as an excuse, Doug. The Europeans, after all, definitely they are more exposed to terrorist attacks coming from the Middle East than the United States. Geographically speaking, they are only a few hours away from the North African coast. So obviously, they are in much greater danger of being the object of terrorist attacks. Not to mention a local population, which the percentage of which comes from countries which are which provide a lot of the terrorists. So definitely they are at risk, but that's no reason not to intervene militarily. It is a fact that without the US urging, these countries have not done much, and the European Union even less. They are very reluctant to intervene militarily. Each country, member of the EU, having its own good reasons not to do so. Germany, because they claim that they have no army. France, because they want to maintain their good diplomatic relations with a number of North African countries, which are also French-speaking. Italy, because Italy would not intervene by itself, except for Libya, with which they are more familiar for historic reasons. But it is a fact that without the US prodding, so to speak, the European Union would be extremely, the Europeans in general, would be extremely reluctant to intervene. The proximity that plays a role. The trade, the economic trade and imports of oil also, let's not forget that unlike the United States, Europe has no oil. So they are dependent to a large extent on the Middle East oil. So they want to also maintain good relations to the countries in the region. That explains their reluctant to intervene militarily. But that's still no excuse, because indeed, the European unions, for instance, have done nothing while ISIS was taking hold in large parts of Iraq and Syria, threatening the Europeans first, actually. Not to mention all the Europeans who joined ISIS in Syria and Iraq, planning to come back to those European countries, and some of them even committed terrorist attacks on European soil. So there is no excuse. We thought the United States, the European would have been and have been extremely timid when it came to fighting terrorism. And also they are extremely ambivalent diplomatically. On the one hand, they count on the United States to lead any type of operations against terrorism in the Middle East or somewhere else. But at the same time, when the US intervenes, diplomatically, the European Union, generally speaking, that denounce the intervention as US military interference in other countries' affairs. So it's a very ambivalent position, which obviously doesn't play well in Washington. From Steve, China also looks to have influence around the world. Have they done a lot of military intervention lately, or do they have a different approach? Well, China, for the time being, has definitely a different approach. It has a diplomatic approach, it has an economic approach, and also militarily they have not intervened, but do not forget that in the region of the South China Sea, they have developed and installed a very important military presence by, as you remember, installing equipment, military equipment, and bringing troops from mainland on small islands which are claimed by other countries in the area, like the Philippines, and even when they got a verdict from the International Tribunal against them, by which those islands should be returned to the Philippines or to Vietnam, they have not complied. They continue to develop them by thumbing their nose at the decision, the ruling of the court. So they are, wherever they can get away with it, they are developing their military presence in South China Sea in particular. Obviously, they have not done anything militarily in Taiwan and in Hong Kong for the time being, but in Hong Kong, as you know, they are putting political pressure on the local government, and in other countries of the world, including Africa and even South America, in the backyard of the United States, their presence has been increasing dramatically over the past few years with their economic investments. So yes, they're trying to exercise much more influence around the world than, let's say, 10 years ago. It's visible. From Emily, how great is the threat of war with China? What would either country achieve with military conflict? I don't know. I don't believe that there is an immediate threat of war with China. And obviously, the Chinese government knows its limits and how far to go in its dispute with the United States, both economically and militarily. Nonetheless, for the Chinese leadership, the presence, again, as I mentioned, I think last week, the mere presence, military presence of the United States in Asia in itself is an anomaly. And the main goal of the Chinese foreign policy in Asia when it comes to the United States is to eliminate the presence of the United States from Asia and from the rest of the Asian countries. How can that be achieved? Obviously, they do not want to get involved militarily, and for the time being anyway, the US is much superior militarily to China. And the Chinese know it very well. But economically and diplomatically and politically, China is increasing pressure on all the governments in the region to weaken the American influence in the region. The best example is the Philippines. In Vietnam, they are also very active. In Malaysia, Singapore, in all these places, the Chinese are trying to increase their economic and financial influence and to push out the United States. I don't believe at the present time anyway that there is any possibility of real war there, though, for the time being anyway. From Steve again, in Russia, also under pressure, is Russia also under pressure internally regarding its current interventions around the world? Definitely Russia is under pressure. And I believe that for the time being in Washington, the prevailing view is China became the primary foe of the United States and competitor, at least for now, economically, but also very slowly militarily. And that Russia, of course, is a threat to United States interests, particularly in Europe, but does not have the financial means to compete with the United States. And Russia is definitely under pressure internally. Not only with the virus, which seems to be hitting them extremely hard, even though there is not much, obviously, in the media about it because they don't advertise it. But Putin is under a lot of pressure right now back home. That's why you hear very little about Russia and also about Russian interference into the American elections, because the campaign, for all intents and purposes in this country, has stopped. So there is not much intervention or interference for now. From Alan, can UN play a role in providing residual military presence? Listen, I like to defend the UN's role, but when it comes to residual military presence, I do not believe that UN's presence would be particularly efficient. Well, if you look at places around the world where the UN has a military, so-called military presence, except for a couple of places where they have been fairly successful. One example would be the Democratic Republic of Congo, where a number of UN peacekeepers have sort of kept the peace between, maintained the peace between factions, military militias and factions in the Congo. In places like Lebanon and the border between India and Pakistan, the so-called residual presence or military peacekeeping presence of the UN has not been very successful. Their presence has not prevented the Israelis and Hezbollah from fighting two wars. That did not prevent India from taking control of Kashmir back in January. And generally speaking, the UN presence in Iraq, for instance, has been marginal compared to what the US could bring to the table there. So, not to mention that the US presence itself is extremely limited. As I mentioned to you, when the UN was created and the peacekeeping operations have started, peacekeeping operations, which by the way, are not included and are not mentioned at all in the UN Charter. The peacekeeping operation started only as an initiative of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and then they became something of a tradition at the United Nations. But in order for the UN, for a UN peacekeeping operation to be deployed anywhere in the world, it has to receive the approval of the host countries. And this is number one. It's very seldom granted by the host countries. And also when it is granted, the peacekeeping operations for a long time were just that. Their objective was to be a buffer zone, if you will, or to maintain peace between two parties that had already accepted not to fight each other, just as an observer, to make sure that there was that good faith prevailed on both parties and none of them starts the conflict first. And very often it proved inefficient because, for instance, in the 1956 Israeli-Arab war, just before the war, when the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal and was preparing a war with Israel, there was a UN peacekeeping force at the time in the Sinai Peninsula. And at the time, the Secretary General was a Burmese gentleman called Utant. And the Egyptian government, Nasser, asked the United Nations to withdraw his peacekeeping force from there, from the Sinai, allowing the Egyptian troops to cross the Suez Canal to attack Israel. And the Security Council had no other option, since the host country did not want its presence any longer on Egyptian soil in this particular instance, than to withdraw the peacekeeping force, which it did. And 2 days later, the Egyptian troops, the war, the 6-day war, as it was called after that, started. So the UN presence is not particularly efficient. And in countries particularly, like Afghanistan or Iraq, where factions have decided to fight it out, it's only an American presence which can impose militarily by force some kind of truce or lack of fighting. The UN wouldn't be very efficient in cases like that. From Edward, as the United Nations and other organization courts seem totally impotent in restraining the Red Chinese effort to expand its hegemony in the South China Sea, what might the United States do to thwart that? Not much, except, well, not much. When I say not much, obviously it is not going to go to war with China over their increased presence in the China Sea. That being said, a mere American presence in the area, military presence in the area, will definitely deter and dissuade the Chinese from more aggressive moves against their neighbors there. But to do something about them, that the best, I mean, the only thing that I see at the present time, which might prompt the United States to intervene militarily or to threat a military intervention against China, would be some kind of Chinese military move against Taiwan. That probably would prompt the U.S. to do something against Red China, and this is why also Beijing and the leadership, being aware of that, is not trying to do anything. As I said at the beginning, the Chinese leadership knows very well how far it can go without incurring an American reaction, a military reaction. I mean, diplomatic, it's one thing, but a military reaction, it's a totally different thing. So they know how far they can push the United States and how far they can go in trying to increase their influence. From Shelley. Hi, Shelley. What role, if any, question should be in French. What role, if any, can American allies, Formosa, South Korea, Japan, play in balancing the growing Chinese influence and physical presence you outlined earlier? Except for getting American, more recent and state-of-the-art weapons from the United States, there is not much that Taiwan or South Korea or Japan will do. South Korea obviously is engaged, is much busier to contain threat from the north than from China. Japan is more or less playing a neutral role because Japan has not, like Germany, they do not have a real army to speak of. And Taiwan does have a very good army, but obviously faced with an invasion from continental China, they couldn't do much. So these allies are trying to number one, to maintain some kind of good relations with Beijing, on the one hand, diplomatically and trade-wise, and not to provoke the Chinese too much. And also, they place themselves under the American military umbrella, including the nuclear one, as far as Japan is concerned. So that's about all that they can do, hoping for the best, and trying to avoid any provocation towards Beijing. From Ron, the financial crisis in 2008 gave birth to the Leaders Summit of the Group of 20 that resulted in major powers working together to restore the global economy. Do you think that G20 could play a similar role in addressing the coronavirus and planning strategies to deal with future virus outbreaks? Maybe. I say maybe because the coronavirus crisis is not over yet. So probably, as far as the current crisis is concerned, I don't know if the G20 could play a role at this time. However, since every country seems to be working on the virus separately, maybe there are some cooperation between a researcher and epidemiologist in all these countries. But the G20 probably in this particular crisis might not play a major role. As for the future, that's a possibility, that's a distinct possibility that the G20, particularly through its financial might and potential, could play a role in well, for future virus outbreaks, I don't know, but trying to find, in terms of medical research. But do not forget that up to now, it was the World Health Organization was supposed to be playing that role of a specialized agency, which played an important role again in the Ebola crisis. This time, the WHO seems to have missed the mark, and it could very well be that coming out of this coronavirus crisis, particularly the most developed countries in the world, will decide to merge their financial potential to create some kind of I don't know, a medical department, or to create a joint research under one form or another, joint research agency to deal with future viruses. Some planning might be considered next time that the G20 is meeting. That could very well be. But as far as the current crisis is concerned, I don't believe so. It's a bit too late, and right now every country is trying to find specific national solutions for themselves. From Claire, please comment on the possibility of increased cyber warfare. While the virus is not good enough, you need cyber warfare also. as well as conventional terrorism, as each country is struggling to save thousands of lives and its economy simultaneously. Well, there is more than a possibility of cyber warfare. It's not called that way, but definitely cyber warfare is already part of the warfare between China and the United States. It was proved already between China, between Russia and the United States, between Iran and the United States, between Israel and Iran, and so on and so forth. So the cyber warfare has already started. It's not something new. And as for the conventional terrorism, but for the time being, indeed, we have not seen terrorist acts, if that's what you refer to, at this time, mostly because I guess the borders are closed. Borders are closed in Europe, the borders are closed here. So the possibility for so-called potential terrorist acts is somewhat weakened at this time. Whether we'll see an increase once we get out of this crisis remains to be seen. Even though, once again, the number of terrorist acts lately seems to have somewhat diminished. Is it due to better intelligence work done by different agencies, by a better or more efficient coordination between intelligent agencies, by the fact that potential terrorists have been hunted and tracked down and arrested or physically eliminated? All this seems to have helped a decrease lately in 2019 of the number of terrorist attacks worldwide. So it remains to be seen how this is going to unfold once the crisis, coronavirus crisis is over. From Mark, obviously we cherry pick our interventions. As the largest, most powerful country in the world, do we have a moral obligation to intervene in some conflicts, whether there is a financial gain or not? Is there a moral obligation to be on the right side of history? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Mark, the moral intervention to be on the right side of history, this is very nice when you're a president and you present your arguments to the nation, why your country should go to war. Obviously, it's not only in this country, but generally speaking, when a president makes an intervention, he would like to say that he's on the right side of history, generally speaking, as an argument for intervention. Now, the right side of history, as many other things in foreign policy, are very much open to interpretation. You can look at both sides fighting each other, and each of them will claim that he's on the right side of history. So, as I mentioned to you earlier, a freedom fighter on the one side is considered to be a terrorist on the other one. So each one is on the right side of history, according to how that side sees history. As for the moral obligation, yes, as I mentioned to you, there are instances in which a country like the United States, with high values in when it comes to human rights, when it comes to um, respect the law, respect of laws, might feel that has a moral obligation to intervene in some conflicts, particularly again when it comes to genocide. When it comes to exactly like in although they cherry pick their intervention also, the US has not done anything in Myanmar to help out the Rohingya refugees there. However, it intervened in Bosnia. So there is cherry picking also in a number of, and intervened particularly in Kosovo. So there is cherry picking even when the moral obligation, also so-called moral obligation, would expect you to intervene no matter where. So it's very difficult to tell, but probably politically speaking, a country, even if in two cases of so-called equal moral obligation, the countries which are about to intervene, they still look at their own national interests before determining where and how to intervene. And then they adjust and they adapt the narrative to their own interests. In other words, they're going to underline the importance of intervening in Bosnia, for instance, or in Kosovo, but not in Myanmar. So there is always a double standard, even when there is a moral obligation to intervene, because after all, states are states, and every country has its own national interest, and it looks at them first and foremost. From Emily, maybe I missed it, but did you answer iPhone's question about the pandemic leading to increased global terrorists? Maybe I missed it too, Emily. No, I did not. Well, that was part of the question asked by Claire, I guess. I haven't seen any sign up to now, anyway, that the pandemic has in any shape or fashion increased the number of terrorist acts around the world at this time. I haven't seen anything. One could expect that maybe terrorists would like to take advantage of the fact that the governments are busy somewhere else trying to save lives and deal with the virus in order to take advantage of this temporary weakness and then commit terrorist acts. I haven't seen anything so far since this has broke out in end of January, anything that makes me believe that that was the case. On the contrary, I haven't seen any terrorist or global terrorist act for the past couple of months. So I believe that, again, because the security measures which have been taken since the outbreak are much stronger and have improved, and the borders have been closed, and there is a much closer attention paid to who does what in terms of confinement, in terms of movement of people. Probably that hindered or prevented acts of terrorism that otherwise had been planned or would have taken place. So on the contrary, for now, anyway, I haven't seen any increase in that area. Hopefully, it will continue even after this is over. I don't see anything else here. Everybody's happy. Yeah, I can tell, Emily, you're very happy with the intervention and non-intervention. I'll try for the next couple of weeks to look into subjects and topics that we do not have usually time to develop, including maybe some which are less associated with foreign policy and more with domestic issues, but which are very topical at this time. I don't know yet, but what I was planning to do also is to address a little bit the issue of healthcare, which is a very topical issue at the present time. Healthcare in the United States and the rest of the world, to draw a comparison between how this crisis is dealt with in terms of healthcare in this country and elsewhere abroad, and also maybe something about the so-called deaths of despair, which are drugs, suicide, and again, this virus, the crisis, and the healthcare. I have hesitated to. I'm still hesitating to broach the subject because obviously we are depressed enough. I don't know if subjects like suicide and drugs and are particularly relevant at this time. But unfortunately, in foreign policy, as you very well know from the beginning, we don't have too many cheerful issues to discuss. We could, but then it wouldn't be it wouldn't be accurate. So let's see. But again, usually our subjects are more specific. Whether it's Brexit or the Middle East or a different specific country at one time, or the relations between two countries and so forth. Now we have a little more time because there is nothing happening in that area, and maybe we can broach something, consider something else. There are some more questions here. Smart to talk about domestic issues on Zoom. We cannot yell at each other or throw anything. Absolutely right, Larry. I didn't even think about it, but you're absolutely right. This is a unique opportunity to broach subjects which are contentious and controversial. This week, this way, really. And the only thing, don't give out your emails to each other, because you can send emails to each other which are unpleasant after our, I gave out my email, so I take responsibility. You can email me whatever you want, but you don't send emails to each other on this issue. From Mark, misery loves company, sunlight. Yes, for today, but it's going to rain later, I guess. I don't want to rain on your parade, but unfortunately, we had a beautiful day yesterday. I don't know how much sunlight we'll be getting in the next couple of days. Hopefully you will. From Lila Cohen, from Fred, do you see any tie in the drop of oil revenue with the drop in terrorism? To be honest with you, I never saw any tie between the drop of oil revenue and the drop in terrorism, because it's not the same source. On the contrary, I would say. I don't know how we can link the drop. If you can expand on it a little more and try to explain to me how you see, if you do, any tie in the drop of oil revenues and the drop in terrorism. I just don't see the connection. And from Claire, I think your new ideas are great as long as non-political, to avoid virtual fighting. Well, virtual fights, I mean, there would be no injuries, number one, and probably they can be broken up more easily than real fighting in the council chambers. That being said, no, there would be no political. That I promise. I always, for what, 3.5 years that we've been having classes together, I avoided as much as I could political views or positions. So it would be non-political, I promise, as usual. I just give you the facts as usual, and then you make up your minds. And then again, you can insult each other by email. By the time we get back together, according to Michel, it won't happen before the fall. You will have forgotten, so everything will be fine by the time we meet again in the fall. Since it seems that the summer session, if we do have one, I don't know yet, the summer dates have not been communicated to me. Usually, as you know, we have 4 sessions in July, the 4 Mondays in July. Let's see what happens this year. Maybe we will, since the last session of this cycle is on June 1st. So we have a whole month of hopefully slowly getting out of this confinement. From Mark, can you foresee a major economic depression coming? Well, I don't have to foresee it, Mark. we are in it. We are just not aware of it because we are cooped up in our homes, but we definitely are in a major economic depression right now. It is not coming, it's right here. All you have to do is look at the statistic of the number, the number of unemployed and the number of businesses shuttered or closed or which haven't opened yet. The magnitude of it probably will come to light as we go along, but we definitely already in a deep depression right now. The Dow does not represent mainstream. Probably not. Probably not. It's very volatile. It goes up and down lately. It's stabilized to some extent, but it definitely does not represent the mainstream and the economy. Now it remains to be seen also what the magnitude of this depression will be when the activities resume. We'll see at the time how many businesses go out of business and how many, what the consumption will be again, what the consumers, how much the consumers will be able to buy again, to restart, to boost the economy, and how many jobs will have been lost. So again, we do not have the magnitude of it, but it is definitely a major economic depression. And this country is still doing better than most countries for the simple reason that the dollar is still the main currency today in the world. And whenever you have instability somewhere else, businesses and individuals deposit their monies in the United States and open accounts in the United States because the dollar is still the main currency, global currency, has not been replaced by any other currency. And the best example, if you look at the euro, which for a while was supposed to replace the dollar is, despite everything, all the unemployment in the United States, the dollar is stronger against the euro at the present time than before the outbreak started. So it tells you something. The impact of fiscal and state deficits will cause havoc down the road, probably, most likely. But again, the amplitude of that, the degree of the changes will only come to light when this is over, when the crisis, the health crisis or the outbreak is gone. Then we'll be able to measure much more realistically what happened to the US economy. But it's a fact that if the US economy is not doing well, the rest of the world is not doing well. It goes without saying. All right, on that cheerful note, I guess there are no more questions. I wish you a very safe week. I hope that you'll be able, that we have some more sun, Mark, and you'll be able to go out and take a walk once in a while. Bless you. and that will be all meeting next Monday. I see from Edward, the latest piece of news is that the governor of New Jersey just declared that schools will remain closed for the rest of the academic year. But you still have to come back next week, next Monday to school, all right? That does not apply to you guys. All right, well, that's good news for the kids. And it was expected. I mean, they're not going to open the schools and do all the planning for social spacing and in the next month or so that they can open the schools in June. And for what? For 3 weeks, or probably the parents will go crazy. But generally, otherwise, the kids will be happy. From Mark, Pierre, by sunlight, I mean exposure to issues. Oh, okay. I misunderstood. I saw literally the sunlight. All right, exposure to issues. All right, very well. Well, thank you all for showing up today. And then we'll meet next Monday. Remember, the governor decision doesn't apply to you. See you next Monday.